The first sergeant suddenly opened his eyes as the first flakes of grayish snow fell on his worn forehead. Still half asleep, he instinctively patted his cold and atrophied limbs to check if they were still attached to his body. Delighted that his legs were still in one piece and not scattered around a 10-foot radius, he brought his wrist to his face, hoping the watch would grant him a few more minutes of desperately needed respite. Just as his eyes were about to focus on the small quadrant, an unbearable alarm started ringing, shaking him awake to his very soul. Cursing the object and its creators, the sergeant slowly stood up from his hole in the ground and unhurriedly swept away the thin yet sticky layers of dirty snow mixed with fine ash that had accumulated over his drenched uniform. After stretching and yawning, he slung his rifle over his shoulder and held the sling close to his chest. With weighty steps, he started walking over the fresh snow, leaving behind deep footprints in the early hours of the day. The veteran sergeant headed towards the forest's edge, where trenches overlooked the plains from atop the ridgeline. On his way, he rummaged in his deep pockets until his hand recognized the familiar shape of a flimsy box from which he extracted a cigarette, miraculously still dry. Walking past a small campfire surrounded by quiet soldiers, he filled his canteen with a black, hot, and dubious drink from a helmet hung off a tripod of sticks that acted as makeshift pot in the absence of one. Thirsty and cold, he hazarded a quick sip before regrettingly spitting out the poison disguised as broth. As he wiped his mouth with his sleeve, he accidentally stained the 5 service stripes sewn onto the back, each representing 1 year with the uniform. Under normal circumstances, he would have cleaned them right away, but at that moment, he had more pressing concerns to attend. As he steadily made his way through the barren grounds of the leafless forest of burnt tree stumps, a familiar sound started echoing in the distance. At first, he thought nothing of it as, after all this time, the sounds of explosions as well as the agonizing screams of the wounded or the unbearable silent stares of the dead became mere background noise to some like him, just as the sound of passing cars is for granted at all times of the day in big cities. The blast of artillery is an everyday constant on the front lines. On the other hand, it would be suspicious to have a night of quietness there, where the fighting is the most intense. But the sergeant's ears were sharp, and his intuition was even more so. Something about this particular barrage felt unfamiliar, unheard of, alien even. But, as much as he tried, he could not figure out what this disquieting incognita was. He hurried up, and as soon as he cleared the tree line, he jumped inside the muddy trenches, filled ankle-high with stagnant and repugnant water of untold months of rain and filth. Struggling, he hardly dragged his boots towards the highest viewpoint of the labyrinth, Hill 17, returning the salute to the few soldiers who still bothered to stand as he passed by. For each exhausting step he took, his senses awaked just a little, more from the uneasy slumber, so much so that when he finally reached the observation post, he was fully awake and sure something was inexplicably wrong. "Sarge," the corporal mumbled while chewing on a particularly hard and untasty meat ration. As he finally gulped down the stubborn strip of flesh, he offered to his superior a steaming flask containing yet another uninviting dark, gooey liquid which was promptly refuted as the non-commissioned officer shoved away the soldier's hand and quickly climbed the dugout's parapet without saying a word. The corporal was surprised when the sergeant declined the drink he offered, as the other did not distort his sight from the trenches of the contact line just a couple of kilometers from their position. The two had been comrades in arms for several years already and had developed a deep respect and bond with each other. He knew from experience that nothing good ever happens when the senior enlisted had that worried look on his face. Without needing to be told, he jumped down from his modest seat, which was an empty ammo crate, to grab a muddy and moldy box from the rusty foldable table riddled with holes. With grunts of frustration and some standard-issued imprecations, he shook it open, revealing 2 pairs of binoculars in dire need of maintenance. After giving them a good swipe from dirt and snow with the end of his mantle, he handed one set to the sergeant. The shelling started precisely at 4:30 hours. "Nothing out of the ordinary," the corporal reported, bringing the lenses to his eyes. "Call the HQ." The other replied while methodically scanning the forward friendly positions. Hearing the command, the corporal turned to his right and nodded to the young private silently standing beside them, who, without needing any more instructions, disappeared. behind the muddy edge of the trench line, seemingly without making a sound. Quite perceptive, the new guy, isn't he, Sarge? What's bothering you? He finally asked, noticing that the sergeant was not in the mood for witty remarks, unlike his usual self. The enemy artillery is different tonight. What? No way! How is it any different? The barrage started just as I woke up, as usual. The corporal commented while, in a futile attempt, trying to get a better resolution by bringing his eyeballs closer to the binoculars as the bright flashes of explosions tearing through the first line reflected on the dark lenses in the moonless night. As usual, each deflagration carried a massive load of energy that manifested with visible shockwaves and even more noticeable plumes of dust and debris, which dotted the entirety of the line. Sir, the HQ is not answering our calls. All the lines are occupied, the young private reported, having seemingly popped up the mud from nowhere, followed by the radio man, panting and whispering curses as his back arched under the weighty and bulky device. That's not good. That's never a good sign. The two soldiers commented as they stared at the deadly fireworks show, seemingly hypnotized by the bright lights and thundering claps. But as much as he strained his brain to encrypt what unknown variable was out of the ordinary during that seemingly ordinary event, even with all those bright flashes before them, the corporal's mind remained lost in the dark. I'm not following. Sarge, compared to last week, this shelling isn't even that intense. There's something different tonight. Listen. Oh, I'm listening. But I swear to the heavens I'm either too old or too dumb to notice a difference. Maybe I've finally gone deaf. The grizzled veteran nodded on reflection of agreement with his last statement, as his face assumed a somewhat cruel expression of acknowledgement. Artillery is the music of the battlefield, and each army its own orchestra. The sergeant replied with an unexpectedly meaningful tone, which his subordinate found hard to take seriously. Fearing harsh reprisals for speaking up, the corporal limited himself to worryingly looking at him through the very tail of his left eye. As he tilted his head towards his right shoulder, one eyelash arched upward, while the opposing eyelid significantly thinned. I'm being serious, said the first, as his voice held cold reserve. Even if they might sound and look the same to the careless observer, each army's artillery is different and unique. For example, Keltian barrages are much shorter and more intense than the average Ryugian shelling. And who are we listening to now? Replied the witted corporal as he watched absently the first lines. That I don't know. But you must know something since you brought it up. All I know is that we have never faced this enemy. It's the first time I've heard this terrifying symphony. The coalition must have shifted units around. Surprised by the comment, the corporal turned to face the sergeant and asked to explain himself. Listen to the rhythm of each shell that lands. Listen for the boom of each explosion. After some seconds, the corporal's face quickly came alight, for a split second though, as his spirit darkened with pessimism immediately after, as he understood its implications. Confused, the private and the radio man, who were busy physically, arguing with the stubborn radio until then, asked the two for clarifications. The enemy's bombardment is extremely well-timed, frighteningly so. It's like a metronome of death, with each half-second bringing an explosion as a shell hits its intended target without fail. Even as we speak, round after round is exploding with mechanical precision, just like a diligent drummer following the conductor without hesitation. The enemy's artillerymen are doing a damn good job, explained the sergeant, with a tone of admiration for his unknown adversaries. But just as he was about to jump down from the edge of the trench to carry on with his many unattended business, the corporal grabbed the back of his coat sleeve and energetically pulled it to gain his attention. Sarge, look at our trenches. He spoke in a forceful and commanding tone, a stark contrast to his typically cheerful demeanor. Perplexed, the veteran turned around and aligned the magnifying lenses to his eyes once again. Moments passed with neither of the two saying a word. But the private could discern everything the sergeant was thinking by carefully studying the expression on his jaded face, partially concealed behind the cylindrical black gear. Fuck, the sergeant said suddenly, startling the two men looking up to him from the base of the furrow. What is it? Worriedly asked the private, now sweating in cold and unexplainable terror, fearful of the terrifying vastness of the possible responses. The shells are landing inside our trenches, not a single. One missed the dugouts of the first line. Every single one of them hit their mark, down to the centimeter, said the corporal with a dead monotone as he kept scanning the forward positions. The implications were clear for everyone present. The private was just about to open his mouth when a loud scream interrupted him, a guttural cry filled to the brim with urgency and desperation. "Message from HQ!" managed to say out loud the specialist, severely out of breath and in terrible shape. He held his aching lower abdomen with one hand and a rag of paper with the other, as the worn-out patch of the military police dangled from the sleeve of his uniform. "Message from HQ." He kept repeating with no end, like a broken record. The corporal, frustrated and with boiling blood, forcefully opened a plastic chair and shoved the specialist down onto it, who, unable to resist, resignedly fell into the seat. Without wasting time, the sergeant snatched the piece of paper from the breathless man and barked something to the private, who, yet again, disappeared in the intricate layer of trenches. His eyes widened and contracted as he carefully read the contents. His heart seemingly sank lower and lower as he made his way to the bottom of the communication. The corporal was about to ask about the paper when a deep voice spoke in his stead. "What's going on, Sergeant?" said an officer as he walked on them, followed by his adjutant and the private. Pale and wide-eyed, the sergeant was evidently having trouble expressing his mind. So much so that the specialist had to intervene, finally freed from the invisible burden weighing on his chest that impeded his breathing. "The HQ has been lost, sir," calmly said as he spun his head to look at the major. "Explain yourself, now." The specialist reached out to grasp the dirty document he was entrusted with, but hesitated halfway through, realizing there was no need to subject them all to the overwhelming amount of text. He decided that his simple statement would suffice. "For now." Rocking his head back to look at the cloudy sky, he took a big breath before gazing back at his fellow soldiers with a loud exhale. "It's a mess. It's all a big fucking mess. Like fireflies in the holy night, enemy units popped out of nowhere behind our lines. They blew up ammo depots, railway hubs, radio stations, and everything in between. Some targeted our artillery positions, quickly overwhelming our unprepared artillerists, while others disabled our air defense network from within." The listeners stood quiet, in dead silence. Where they could not get close, or in the few instances they were repulsed, they simply called in airstrikes. "As their crafts now soar uncontested in the sky," he said as he slowly regained his composure. "Our lines have been breached. The enemy has achieved breakthroughs in every sector, taking advantage of the confusion they ruthlessly created. We suspect enemy airmobile units are heading north, swiftly overrunning the oil fields, while heavily mechanized formations are currently stubbornly pushing through our southern underbelly, panic-stricken as our chain of command has been paralyzed. They will soon reach the capital." "And what about us?" murmured the private, astonished and lost. "The last order from high command, before it was turned into a smoking crater, was for you to hold the line, as long as possible." Just as the specialist finished talking, everyone's attention was diverted as the rumble of artillery suddenly ceased, and quietness returned on the front lines. Hesitantly, they climbed back up and slowly poked their heads out from the shallow ditch they were hiding in. In complete hush, they all watched as the dust slowly fell graciously, as the last shell had landed. Before them, an alien yet somewhat familiar landscape presented itself to the observers. Simple, snow-filled fields and barren expanses were distinctive of the world after the bombs. "Look, over there," the private screamed in terror as he pointed at undistinctive cones of lights that were quickly and furiously moving under the shower of dust and particles that still floated as a result of the bombardment. Horrified, the soldiers glared at the hundreds of armored vehicles quickly approaching their positions under the shrouding embrace of the night as fear tightly grasped their bodies and spirits. Everyone kept staring at the overwhelming show of power, at the arrogant and prideful fist of steel about to savagely smash into the paper-thin positions. Everyone but the sergeant. As if under suggestion by a higher entity, or maybe a macabre premonition, he raised his sight to the sky, where he diligently scouted its entirety, looking at each minute detail, seemingly searching for something. A brushstroke out of place, a simple shape, a minute object inaudibly flying over them just beneath the grim, gloomy clouds caught his attention. He stared at it inquisitively, wondering about its purpose. With a swift motion, he aimed his binoculars at the peculiar entity. He could not make out its exact shape or form, but he noticed a sphere-like appendage that rested on its belly. For some unknowable reason, his instinct told him that thing was staring back at him with its cold, ruthless, and mechanical eye. He realized it was pointing directly at them. But his contemplative stare-down did not last long, as a 155mm laser-guided artillery shell burst in the air just a couple of centimeters from the top of the trench. As their lifeless bodies lay there, in the cold, undignified ditch, the ground violently shook as heavy tracked vehicles, proudly waving high a blue flag, uncaringly rolled over their positions, now left unmanned in their entirety. Just a few steps away from the specialist's hand, dipped in the dirty water infested by rodents, lay the piece of paper he had worked so hard to deliver. Even though it was partially covered in blood, mud, and ash, one could still clearly read the last line at the bottom of the document written in bold and darker characters, making it easy for everyone to understand the seriousness behind it. Hold. The line. The humans are coming. Enjoy another amazing story to His Holiness, the High Priest. This seal must be exclusively opened in his presence and with his direct approval. Praise thy Lord. As requested by his sanctity, the following is a shortened and edited account of the official report issued to the Grand Council of Priests by me, a mere envoy sent to investigate the latest stellar claim by the astral domain of mankind, colloquially known as humans. I humbly thought it appropriate to provide additional context regarding the reason for my dispatch. As His Holiness will surely know, when an empire lays claim to something, be it a single celestial body or a specific space sector, said claim needs to be approved by the galactic community before being officially recognized. This procedure allows other eligible parties, usually neighboring powers, to file a counterclaim if they are also interested in obtaining the objects of the original demand. When Earth requested full custody of the small exoplanet R1P32 Miraros, no one objected to it initially. But during a meeting of the Grand Council, someone questioned humanity's true intention when acquiring such an insignificant planet, which happened to be halfway from ours and their respective sphere of influence. Given the yearly claim limit allocated to each empire by the terms of the Galactic Power Index, the Terran's choice to request control of R1P32 Magnetar, which will be referred to as R1P for practical reasons, was a complete mystery to us, as there are many more valuable assets that remain unclaimed on the star map. R1P does not hold the fuel of a gas giant. It does not contain the resources of a dense iron moon, and it certainly does not have the aesthetic beauty and desirability of many other planets. The air is barely breathable for both of our people and is too exposed and impractical to serve as a military outpost, let alone a trading post, as the lack of a strong magnetic field makes it vulnerable to severe cosmic radiation. Frequent in the sector, and the atmosphere is too thin to stop most meteorites, whose craters litter the surface. The original report provides a more detailed list of unfavorable characteristics. After 3 days of closed-door consultation, the Grand Council agreed to send me, the Archbishop of Lenya, to investigate if this mysterious planet could hold any worth to us and to uncover any potential scheme by the untrusty humans. Before setting off, I activated my vast network of contacts and informants and discovered something quite noteworthy. As your sanctity will surely remember, 7 years ago, a severe rebellion, mainly composed of dissidents and disgruntled settlers, was violently quelled by the iron fist of Earth's governmental forces, or so they led us to believe. That is not entirely true. The rebel forces adopted a guerrilla warfare approach, extensively prolonging the conflict. Although hostilities significantly quieted after that famous battle years ago, the last embers of resistance were extinguished just a month ago with the fall of R1P, as that exoplanet apparently served as the last stronghold of the insurgent forces. With this knowledge in mind, I ordered my crew to set coordinates for this enigmatic, lone wanderer of a planet. During the short jump, I mentally and physically prepared to interact with humans. As soon as we exited hyperspace just outside of the planet's pull, we had to immediately throw our gravitational anchors to halt our momentum, as all around us, a seemingly unending number of wrecks were floating lifelessly in the cold void. Having spent plenty of time alongside the Navy of Sul, I recognized some of those lightless hunks of steel, either by crest number or hull shape. One in particular stood out to me, catching my attention. On a fragment of composite hull, barely visible, obscured by the numerous debris and blackened by marks of explosions, one could read G2223. She was a super carrier from the 7th Grand Fleet. Over 35,000 personnel are required to crew a ship of her class. I witnessed her in action during the war against the Union, credited with 192 kills and over 400 assists. Her presence alone was enough to spread fear and panic in her enemy's ranks, but looking around, one would see, a few hundred meters ahead of us, the deformed frames of ships clearly not of military origin. Those were the rebel starcrafts, repurposed civilian vessels for the most. But among them, one could spot the odd captured Navy vessel, repainted and renamed. All around us, a thick, dreadful, macabre cloud of shipwrecks surrounded the planet, shrouding it like an artificial asteroid field, only composed of thousands of mingled and carbonized hulls, all of which were once vessels that served humanity in one way or another. They now only serve as grim steel caskets with side panels, punctured by railguns and latches ripped off by fission torpedoes. Hundreds of thousands of crafts of all shapes and sizes were left slowly drifting, powerless and aimlessly orbiting this forsaken corner of the universe, to be swept from bow to stern by cold solar winds and heavy gravitational waves. As a sort of tasteless cosmic jest, or maybe a dreadful omen to carefree visitors, the majority of these carcasses of steel were concentrated along the equatorial line. Shortly after our arrival, the light from the distant parent yet uncaring star shone through the empty void of space, reflecting on the metallic surfaces of the starship's remains, creating a beautiful yet twisted game of lights. From afar, one would think that this planet of death was crowned not by an ordinary ring of natural origins, but by a holy halo whose brightness was a sum of some of the darkest entities imaginable. The reverberating voice of space traffic control, shouting through the speakers, shook me from my deep thoughts. After moving to the instructed coordinates, 2 tugboats towed us through a safe corridor towards the exoplanet. As my ship remained in the upper atmosphere, I boarded a shuttle and headed for the surface, where a human official was waiting for me. During the short flight, looking out the small window of my craft, I witnessed the full extent and magnitude of the scars left by human warfare on this celestial body. The fighting was so ferocious that topographic maps must have been redrawn constantly, as mountain ranges were flattened and new crevasses appeared after the dust settled where intricate layers of trenches once stood. As we flew past the boundary between 2 continental plates, I observed that, in certain places, even the bedrock had been turned inside out. The violent shaking and rearrangement of the tectonic plates had caused a significant height difference of up to hundreds of meters between the two. For example, one settlement or a military outpost was situated in the middle of the crack and, as a result, was split in 2. As my shuttle touched down on the last remaining stronghold of the planet, the situation surrounding me appeared bleak. Besides most buildings being turned to dust and rubble, the atmosphere had a spectral quality that I find hard to describe. Constantly shrouded by an eerie and unsettling fog, the command center was perched on top of what I can only describe as a marshy swamp under the perennial hammering of heavy rains. There, far away from the distant star's light and God's blissful touch, nowhere did I find the pride, might, and arrogance that I have always associated with humans. As I looked around, I saw soldiers slowly and hesitantly trudging forward, staggering, and seemingly stumbling with every step. Their eyes were empty and fixed in a forward gaze, as if searching for something in the distance. However, they couldn't seem to find anything to focus on, and the blankness in their gaze remained a disquieting constant. No words escaped their mouths, though their heads ached with screams. 1,000-yard stare is how humans call this condition in common jargon. They use it to roughly describe the condition of some people who have seen and lived through, and I quote, too much. It was troublesome, but at last, After a good half an hour of wandering around broken tents and smoldering barracks, I managed to find my human counterpart, the general. When I reached him, he was exposed to the rain, sitting on the edge of a pillbox littered with the marks of hundreds of rounds. He was silently staring at the foggy horizon, using a sandbag as a pillow. "Good evening, sir. I'm the Archbishop of Lenya," I said lowly, in a respectful voice. As he turned around, I saw his exhausted expression, one that mirrored the void of everyone around me. "Good evening," he replied in a flat and emotionless tone. The general was a shattered man who seemed no different than the deceased, except for the fact that he still had a beating heart, but even that was up for debate. I felt sorry for him, as well as for his soldiers and the entire situation. However, I had a task assigned by the council, which I was obligated to fulfill. Almost scared to ask, I announced the reason for my visit. "Why do you want this planet?" I inquired while raising my head to look at all the nothingness of the barren expanse that this space rock had to offer. The general appeared to concur with my statement as he let out a sad chuckle upon hearing my words. Then, he looked at me, straight into my eyes, and spoke with a force and power that I believed he had lost. "Who operated that anti-air battery?" said while pointing at a distant object whose original shape was impossible to discern from the twisted steel burned to a crisp. I was unable to reply. Robert was the commander who re-enlisted to spare young men's lives, not that his sacrifice changed much. Sam was the gunner who ran away from his family's farm on Mars. Too boring for him. I'm sure he had enough adrenaline during his final moments to make up for a lifetime of growing potatoes. Joe was the spotter who signed up for the armed forces to pay for his sister's college. I'm confident she will jump with joy knowing she won't have to pay a dime for education thanks to his service. Mark was the loader, barely 20 years, old, who enlisted to impress his family and friends. I'm sure they were elated when the postman delivered an empty coffin wrapped in a blue flag with a fucking medal thrown on top by some grand marshal who could not even be bothered with taking his white gloves off. I kept silent. But the general's voice grew louder. Who was she? Turned into red mist by a 152mm artillery shell as she was running to administer aid to a comrade, said as he pointed to a specific crater next to a pillbox. Who was he? Killed during a rare moment of rest by a kamikaze drone? Vigorously exclaimed as he pointed a black halo a few meters away. And who was he, whose last vision before death must have been hypothermia and blood loss, laughing beside him, betting with a pair of dices over who would have the pleasure of taking him first? Furiously shouted as he pointed to the unnamed field off in the distance, obscured and concealed by the grim haze. Akin to a dam needing to open its gates after a flood, the man would have released a stream of tears without a doubt, if only he had any left. Son, Archbishop, 28 million men and women died on this damn rock. Counting both sides, 28 million humans died, and 4 million more are reported as missing. Missing where exactly? Here? Maybe there? This glorified asteroid is too small to get lost on, and where would they even go? No flora or fauna, not one civilian settlement or mining rig is left standing, and I can assure you no one will come by to rebuild them. There's nothing in here. As a priest, out of habit or perhaps empathy, I extended my arm and offered my ear to console this poor soul. Why are we even here? To fight the rebels? To preserve our glorious species? They wanted to avoid taxes and do their own things? Fine. Who cares? It does not matter how it all started and what they did. History will just remember them as violent terrorists, even if that is far from the truth. History is written by the victor, after all, I replied with a sorrowful tone of understanding. No, history is written by those who remain and rewritten, by those who follow. Our struggles, pain, and losses will become mere statistics. And for what? To get yelled at once we go back home? To be hated by our people for following orders from puppets they elected? The man paused amid his emotional outburst to catch his breath and regain his composure. He held his naked head in his hands, and even though it was raining heavily, the downpour didn't let up for a moment. In fact, it seemed to intensify as if the sky was crying along with him in response to his heartfelt words. Where is your God, Archbishop? he murmured like someone who had finally gone crazy. God is in all things, but his plan is complex and unknowable, and even if he seems distant and unreachable, he always looks after all his children. Despite my good intentions, my tone and shaky voice betrayed my emotions, as I realized it must have been difficult for him to have faith in the bigger picture after witnessing what no one deserves to see. Are we also his children, Father? I believe so, yes. God manifests differently to each creature of the cosmos. He might have thousands of names and even more faces, but he remains one and only. The general finally raised his gaze to the sky, in the process, cursing the heavens in the freedom of his mind. His pupils remained steady as heavy drops of rain fell upon them, and his empty eyes held firm as lightning flashed across the desolate landscape. Either we are his worst children, or he turned a blind eye to this corner of the universe, maybe both. Uttered with a resigned sigh, I wanted to intervene and correct his twisted thought process, but I realized that, at that moment, no words would have changed his disappointed, desperate opinions. I understand how you feel, and although I am not in a position to judge you or your people, I would like to offer our assistance. It would be an honor for us to help you provide a proper burial to all the lost souls of this conflict. If you wish, we would also be happy to assist you in returning the bodies of the warriors to their rightful place. Not even the torrential downpour could conceal the sad smile that flickered across the man's face. Without averting his gaze from the dreary clouds above, he replied with resolve. There are no hidden motives or strange plans behind our request for this exoplanet. Everything here is as you see. Nothing to mine, nothing to harvest, nothing to boast about. I was about to ask for the real reason, but the general seemed to be able to read my mind. You want to know why we want R1P so badly? It's quite simple, really. Even in the darkest and most dire situations, we must not forget what makes us human. We need to hold on to our values and principles. The Iliad illustrates this point perfectly. Despite being sworn enemies, Achilles allowed Priam to bury his son, which finally brought him peace after days and nights of unending suffering and grief after the loss of his dear friend. I was confused by his reference, which seemed rooted in ancient myths and legends, but I knew better than to interrupt. In death, all of us are equal, regardless of how or why we fought. It is our utmost duty to pay tribute to those who sacrifice their lives in defense of their beliefs. We understand that it is not possible to find and bury all the bodies where they rightfully belong. However, for those who remain undiscovered, it is vital that we offer them eternal peace. While we certainly appreciate it, there is no need for you to help. Once our claim is recognized by the galactic community, all the fallen will sleep easy, knowing they are not forgotten, as they will forever rest on human soil. Thanks for diving into this story with me. Don't miss out on the next one. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a big thumbs up, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think.